All right, y'all. I need to be careful with this one because this is one of those topics where people already have a conclusion before the conversation sort of even starts, right? And I get it, this isn't like abstract, this isn't emotional, personal, serious, but what started bothering me wasn't just, the topic itself, it was how confidently people were quoting God on something that the text never clearly says, right? And so I had to ask myself, am I hearing scripture or am I hearing interpretation? So the question nobody really wants to ask. Let's slow this down. This is not about what you feel. This is not about what you've been told. It's kind of just this. Where does the Bible explicitly say that abortion is wrong? Not implied, not assumed, not interpreted. Explicitly. And when I couldn't find it, that's sort of when something kind of started to shift for me, right? Because now the conversation needs to change from what does God say, to what are we now adding to what God said. Now, I know what you're going to think, that kind of hits you, right? Because we keep going back to the scripture in Proverbs 3 verse 5, lean not unto your own understanding, right? So the tension is we're told not to lean on our own understanding, but then we end up building entire doctrines and interpretations that sort of require our own understanding, right? So that's kind of the first crack for me. Now, let's go and talk about what the text actually says, right? Psalms 139, verse 13, right? For you formed my inward parts, you knit me together in my mother's womb. Now, what I used to think was that this proves that life must be protected at all stages, right? But then I had to be honest with myself, right? Because this verse is describing formation. But if formation automatically meant guaranteed life 100% of the time, then how do we explain miscarriages, stillbirths, pregnancies that do not continue? So the breaking point for me is that God forms, but not every formation continues, right? So the shift for me is that this verse is showing that the process is not a promise. Then in Jeremiah 1 verse 5, right? Before I formed you, I knew you. A lot of people like to say that, right? Because they think life begins before birth, therefore they must be physically protected, right? But look a little deeper. Before I formed you, right? So now we have existence before the body. So the shift for me is that if the being exists before the body, then the body is not the beginning of existence, right? So a realization moment is going on for me. So ending the body does not automatically equal ending the being. And I think that complicates the conversation a little bit because in Genesis 1 verse 27, if we're talking about how everyone is created in the image of God, that all human life is sacred because it reflects God, you kind of have to ask yourself a question. Do we apply that consistently? Right? Because if that's absolute, then war becomes a problem, execution becomes a problem, self-defense becomes a problem, the justification becomes a problem, right? Because people make exceptions there. So this insight is going off for me. It's like the issue is not just the verse, right? The issue is it's about how selectively we apply the verse, right? In Genesis 2 verse 7, it's talking about what? The breath of life, and man became a living soul. So what is standing out here? Formation happens first, right? And then after formation happens, then breath is sort of activating life, right? So the question becomes, is the text defining life at formation or at the activation of life? And if that's unclear, right? If that's unclear for us, then, sometimes certainty, ends up becoming assumption, right? And so where the interpretation ultimately starts to take over is, and maybe a place where I had to check myself is because it's easy to think, that, oh, well, I'm just reading the Bible, right? But what I started to notice is that the mind doesn't really just read. It fills gap, right? It fills gaps, right? Because we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about awareness, right? So, a lot of times when we don't understand things, we don't like ambiguity, right? So we turn, unclear verses into absolute positions, based upon selective need for control, right? Because if I can define something as right or wrong, then I feel grounded, right? I can feel certain, especially if I can find it in someone else, right? I can feel, correct, right? And that's kind of the ego layover that's kind of happening here. And, I know this is the uncomfortable part, but it's that sometimes it's, it's not really about truth, right? For us, a lot of times when we're reading the Bible, it's about being right, right? So scripture becomes, a tool, it becomes a weapon, right? It becomes a justification, right? Instead of something that we're actually trying to understand. And so when you get to the deeper part of the question, the deeper part of the question is that we have to go deeper than the argument itself, right? We have to take this past the surface level. So we have to ask the question, what is a being, right? Is it the body? Is it the biology? Or is it awareness, right? Is it consciousness? Sorry about spitting, but something beyond the physical form, right? Because the text literally keeps pointing to something that exists before the body. It keeps pointing to something that is not limited to the body. It keeps pointing to something that continues beyond the body. And if that's true, then the conversation is not as simple as people are making it out to be. So the realization that's happening for me is that at some point I have to admit that this is not even just about abortion, right? It's more so about how easily we assume, project, and then speak, right, with certainty on something that the text leaves complex, that it leaves, ambiguous for us to decipher. And that ultimately is dangerous, not because of the topic, not because of, what it reveals sometimes about how we are reading, but it reveals about how we read, right? And so the final thing I want to say is that if the text does not say something clearly, then ultimately, even though we have complex issues, we can either sit with the tension, we can kind of acknowledge the complexity of the issue and kind of break it down, right? Or we can just, aimlessly fill in the gaps and then call it truth, right? And that's the real question, right? When you speak on the nature of God, are you repeating what God is talking to you about, or are you using the ego to take over, right?